She was just a lonely girl in a wheelchair, watching the playground from the shadows, until a millionaire stopped, looked closer, and discovered the cruel truth. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the schoolyard, its golden light flickering between the branches of the tall maples that lined the playground fence. Children's laughter spilled into the air in bursts, shouts from the slide, squeals from the swings, but in a small, shaded corner, the sound seemed to fade. There, in front of the unused sandbox, a little girl sat motionless in a wheelchair. Her blue dress was slightly creased beneath the seatbelt straps, and the fabric caught the light in soft folds that contrasted with the pale skin of her small hands resting on her lap. Strands of her light blonde curls were swept across her forehead by a gentle breeze, framing a face that seemed far too quiet for a place meant for play. Her blue eyes followed the movement of other children darting back and forth, yet her gaze lacked the spark of wanting to join in. It was the look of someone who had already learned not to expect an invitation. Just a few feet away, a woman in a plain cardigan leaned against the fence, one hand loosely gripping the handle of the wheelchair as the other scrolled through her phone. She was from the orphanage, the one responsible for bringing the girl here, though she watched the playground with the distant detachment of someone fulfilling a routine, not sharing in its joy. The girl's fingers fidgeted with the hem of her dress, and when she finally spoke, her voice was almost lost beneath the noise of the other children. "They don't want to play with me," she murmured, still looking at the swings. "Because I'm not like them." The words hung in the air, fragile yet unshakable, as a gust of wind rustled through the leaves above. Somewhere nearby, a ball bounced against the pavement, followed by a chorus of laughter from the children chasing it. None of them glanced in her direction. It was as if she existed just outside their world, close enough to see everything but too far for anyone to truly notice her absence. From the far side of the playground, the low rumble of a car door closing broke through the ambient noise of shouting children. A tall figure stepped into view, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that made people naturally turn their heads. The man's light gray suit caught the sunlight in clean lines, its sharp tailoring contrasting with the relaxed way he carried himself. His dark hair was neatly combed back, and his blue eyes moved slowly across the playground, scanning it as if absorbing every detail before deciding where to go. Some of the teachers and parents nearby recognized him immediately: Alex Winters, the CEO whose face had been in recent charity newsletters and business magazines. He was here to meet with a representative from a local foundation, but as his gaze drifted toward the shaded corner near the old sandbox, his plans shifted. He slowed when he saw her, a small girl in a wheelchair, separated from the center of play by more than just distance. There was something in her stillness that made the bustle of the playground feel sharper, as if the noise around her only deepened her quiet. He noticed how her eyes followed the other children with a look that wasn't quite longing anymore, but more like acceptance of being left out. For a moment, he simply stood there, taking in the scene, and then he adjusted his pace and walked toward her. When he reached the edge of the sandbox, he lowered himself into a crouch so that their eyes were level. The movement was unhurried, his expression steady and without pity. Up close, he could see how the sunlight caught in the gold tones of her curls, how her small hands tightened around the edge of her dress as if bracing for an interruption she didn't want. For a few seconds, neither spoke, the laughter from the swings and the chatter of the other kids filling the space between them. Then, with a calm voice that seemed to cut through the background noise without needing to rise above it, he said, "Hi there. My name's Alex. Mind if I sit here with you for a bit?" The question wasn't forced, and the weight of it seemed to surprise her. She glanced at him, hesitant, as though trying to decide whether he was just another adult passing through her corner of the world or someone who might actually stay. Emma hesitated at first, glancing down at her lap as though she could somehow hide behind the folds of her dress. But Alex didn't rush her, his posture relaxed, his hands resting loosely on his knees. After a long pause, she spoke in a voice so quiet that the wind almost carried it away. She told him that her parents had died in a car accident the previous year, the words coming out flat, as if she had repeated them too many times to feel them fully anymore. She explained that she had been in the car too, and while she had survived, the injuries had left her unable to walk. The hospital stay had been long, and afterward, there was no family to take her home. She had been moved to the orphanage, where days blurred together in the same pale walls and the same routines. Her gaze flicked toward the playground, and her voice faltered as she admitted she loved to draw and had once spent hours on the swings at her old house, pretending to fly. Now, the swings felt like something that belonged to another life. Children in the orphanage sometimes played with her indoors, but here, on the playground, they ran in groups, their games made for running feet and quick chases. "They think I'm boring," she said, her small shoulders lifting in a shrug that looked far too practiced. "And when they do talk to me, it's just to ask questions about my chair or why my legs don't work. They never stay to play." Alex listened without interrupting, his blue eyes steady on her as if her words were the only thing that mattered in that moment. The sounds of the playground seemed to fade into the background, leaving just the two of them in that shaded corner. He could see how the quiet around her wasn't just about being left alone, it was the weight of having learned to expect it. And in the way she kept her hands clasped tightly together, he recognized the same guardedness he had once felt himself, years ago, when an accident had nearly taken away his own ability to walk. That memory, long buried beneath layers of success and years of work, rose to the surface with an unexpected sharpness. He realized he wasn't just hearing her story, he was seeing its reflection in his own past, in the nights he had lain awake wondering if the rest of his life would be spent on the outside of everything that mattered. And as she spoke, he knew with absolute certainty that this was not a moment to pass by politely. It was one of those rare crossroads where someone else's loneliness collided with the exact kind of understanding that could change it. Alex stayed crouched beside her for a moment longer, letting her words settle between them before he spoke. When he finally did, his tone was calm but carried a certain weight, the kind that made it clear he was not offering empty comfort. He told her that when he was a boy, he too had faced something that changed the way people looked at him, a serious injury that left him in a hospital bed for months, doctors unsure if he would walk again. He remembered the way friends had stopped visiting, how classmates whispered, and how it had seemed as if his entire future had been rewritten without his permission. But what had made the difference was a single person who refused to see him as broken, someone who showed up day after day until he began to believe that maybe there was still a place for him in the world. Emma listened, her head tilted slightly, as though she wasn't used to hearing an adult talk to her in this way. He didn't soften the truth, and he didn't try to change the subject when it became uncomfortable. Instead, he looked her straight in the eyes, not with pity but with a quiet respect, as if she were capable of hearing everything he had to say. "Emma," he said, lowering his voice so that the noise of the playground faded behind his words, "I can't change what happened to you. But I can promise you something, if you'll let me, I'm going to try to make sure you never have to sit on the edge of the world watching it go by again." Her fingers loosened their grip on her dress, just slightly, as she studied him with cautious curiosity. He didn't push her for a response, he simply stayed there, keeping the promise in his eyes before he stood. Glancing toward the woman from the orphanage, he gave a polite nod, but there was already a plan forming in his mind, the kind of plan that would not wait for slow approval or endless discussion. As he walked away, the playground's noise swelled back into focus, but the quiet corner where Emma sat no longer felt invisible to him. Something had shifted, and he knew with absolute certainty that he wasn't done here, not until she could look at this place and see it as her own. The following morning, Alex walked into the orphanage with the same purposeful stride he'd had on the playground, only now there was a sharper focus in his eyes. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and old carpet, the kind of scent that clings to a place that sees too much wear and not enough investment. The receptionist looked up from her desk, startled by his presence, and within minutes the director of the facility appeared, smoothing down his sweater as if trying to prepare for a meeting he hadn't scheduled. Alex didn't waste time with pleasantries. He explained that he had met Emma, that he understood she was a long-term resident, and that he wanted to know exactly what could be done to improve her daily life both here and outside these walls. As they walked through the hallways, he took in the details that most people might overlook: chipped paint along the doorframes, wheelchairs with worn-out grips, a small common room with games missing half their pieces. The director spoke cautiously, outlining the budget constraints, the lack of specialized equipment, and the difficulties of integrating children with mobility needs into the public playgrounds nearby. Alex listened, nodding, but his mind was already moving several steps ahead. By the time they returned to the office, he had his phone in hand, scrolling through a list of contacts he could call before the day was over. He proposed funding a complete renovation of the nearest playground to make it fully inclusive, with ramps, adaptive swings, and a soft surface ground covering so wheelchairs could move freely. He offered to cover the cost of a specialized outdoor wheelchair for Emma that would let her navigate play spaces without straining her arms. More than that, he insisted that she be among the first children to use the new facilities, so she could step, figuratively, into that space not as a guest, but as someone who belonged there. The director stared at him for a long moment, perhaps trying to gauge whether this was a burst of impulsive generosity or a commitment he truly meant to keep. But the certainty in Alex's tone left no room for doubt. Before leaving, he knelt beside Emma's chair in the common room, where she had been quietly coloring while the adults talked. "I told you I'd try to change something," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "This is the first step." And for the first time since they had met, her mouth curved into a small but unmistakable smile, the kind that hinted at the possibility of believing him. Within days, word of Alex's plan began to ripple through the community, but not all of the reactions were welcoming. The first pushback came quietly, in the form of questions whispered in school hallways and at the edges of playground benches, but soon it grew into more pointed objections voiced at the next parent meeting. The gathering was held in the multipurpose room of the school, the kind of space with stackable chairs and the faint smell of gym mats stored in the corner. Parents lined up in folding seats while a few teachers lingered near the back, clearly anticipating a tense discussion. Maddie Clark, a well-dressed woman with an air of unshakable confidence, was one of the first to speak. She stood, her voice calm but edged with disapproval, saying that while it was generous of Mr. Winters to help, she worried that the project would take resources away from the majority of students. She suggested, in a tone meant to sound reasonable, that maybe a separate play area for children like Emma would be more practical. Across the room, another parent, Daniel Ross, chimed in with a sharper tone, arguing that their own kids shouldn't have to adjust their games just because someone else had limitations. The words landed heavily, echoing the same exclusion that Emma had quietly endured for months. Alex listened without interrupting, his hands folded loosely in front of him, but there was a stillness in his posture that drew attention even before he spoke. When he did, his voice was measured and steady, but there was an unmistakable conviction beneath it. He told them about his own childhood injury, about the isolation that came not from the physical pain but from the way people treated him afterward. He explained that an inclusive playground wasn't a charity project, it was an investment in teaching every child empathy, adaptability, and respect, skills far more valuable than any piece of playground equipment. He moved closer to the center of the room, making eye contact with the parents who had spoken out. When a child learns to pause their game to make sure everyone can join in, that's not them being held back, he said. That's them becoming someone worth looking up to. Then he addressed Maddie's suggestion directly, pointing out that separate always became invisible over time, and that no child deserved to be pushed to the edges of the community just to keep others comfortable. As murmurs spread through the room, he opened his laptop on a nearby table and pulled up the finalized designs for the playground, projected onto the wall so everyone could see. The images showed smooth ramps seamlessly connected to climbing areas, swings that could be used by children with or without mobility aids, and a wide, soft surface field that encouraged mixed play. He highlighted the safety features, the adaptability for different games, and the way it could accommodate more students at once than the current playground. By the time he finished, the room was quiet. Even those who still harbored doubts were silent, unable to find an easy counter to the clarity of his vision. The principal, who had been sitting near the front, broke the silence with a slow nod, saying he looked forward to the ribbon cutting. Alex closed his laptop, not with a sense of triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that one more barrier had shifted. As the meeting ended and parents began to file out, he caught sight of Emma waiting in the hallway with the woman from the orphanage. She didn't know the details of what had just happened, but when their eyes met, she gave him a tentative smile, the kind that said she was starting to believe he was building something that included her in every sense of the word. The day of the playground's opening dawned with a clear sky and a warmth that hinted at the arrival of summer. By mid-morning, the schoolyard was already buzzing with anticipation. Teachers guided clusters of students toward the newly built area, while parents and community members gathered along the edges, their conversations overlapping in a low, excited hum. Bright ribbons stretched across the entrance to the playground, and the fresh scent of cut wood and newly poured rubberized flooring still lingered in the air. Every detail, from the smooth curves of the ramps to the vibrant colors of the adaptive swings, seemed to announce that this was a space built for everyone, without exception. Emma arrived in the company of the woman from the orphanage, her wheelchair rolling easily over the smooth new path that led from the parking lot to the playground gates. Her blue dress fluttered slightly in the breeze, and her curls caught the sunlight like threads of gold. At first, she seemed uncertain, her eyes darting to the clusters of children already exploring the new equipment. But as they saw her approach, a few broke off from their games and came closer, curious rather than wary. Alex, standing near the ribbon with a pair of scissors in hand, caught sight of her and felt an almost physical release of the tension he'd been carrying for weeks. He stepped forward, greeting her with a quiet, "I'm glad you're here," before turning back to the gathered crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried easily over the chatter, but he kept it warm rather than formal. He thanked the builders, the volunteers, and the teachers who had supported the vision, but he didn't linger on his own role. Instead, he told the story of how the project had begun, with a simple conversation by the old sandbox, and how it had grown into a community effort. "This playground isn't about what one person can do," he said. "It's about what happens when we decide no one should have to watch life from the sidelines." He glanced toward Emma as he said it, and though she ducked her head, there was the smallest smile on her lips. The ribbon was cut to a burst of applause, and the children surged forward, eager to test every ramp, swing, and climbing structure. For the first time, Emma didn't have to hesitate or wait for permission. A boy about her age ran up and asked if she wanted to race him down the gentle slope toward the swings. She laughed, truly laughed, and the two of them set off together, her wheels rolling smoothly over the soft surface. A group of girls nearby called for her to join their game, and she wheeled over without needing an adult to mediate the invitation. The sight drew murmurs from the crowd, not because of pity, but because it was so natural, so unforced, as though this had been the way things always were. Alex stood back, watching as the space filled with the kind of mingled laughter and shouting that marked a true playground, the divisions between able and disabled dissolving into nothing more than differences in how games were played. The woman from the orphanage, who had once looked on with quiet detachment, now had her phone raised, capturing video of Emma spinning slowly in the adaptive merry-go-round, her hair flying in the wind. The air felt lighter, as if the space itself had shed the weight of exclusion it once carried. As the morning gave way to afternoon, Alex walked a slow loop around the perimeter, noting small details, the easy way children helped one another onto equipment, the absence of hesitation in their interactions, the visible pride on the faces of parents who had once doubted the project. By the time he made his way back to the gate, Emma was at the center of a group, showing two other children how to work the latch on the swing's harness. It was not the image of a child being accommodated, it was the image of a child belonging. And in that moment, Alex knew the fight to make this place real had been worth every obstacle. By the time the last of the ribbon from the opening day had been swept away and the hum of the crowd replaced by the ordinary rhythm of school life, Alex found himself returning to the playground more often than he had expected. He would arrive in the afternoons, sometimes in a crisp suit fresh from a meeting, sometimes in rolled-up sleeves with no hint of formality, always carrying the same quiet intention, to see how the space lived when the cameras were gone. It was in these unannounced visits that he saw the real victory, not in the shine of new equipment, but in the way it had simply become part of the children's world. The novelty had worn off, and what remained was the unremarkable, beautiful normalcy of inclusion. Emma's life began to shift in ways that were subtle but undeniable. The hesitant glances she used to give when someone invited her to join in were replaced with the easy assumption that she belonged there. The boy who had raced her to the swings on opening day became her regular teammate in playground games, and the girls who had once passed her by without a word now called her name across the yard, pulling her into their circles as naturally as if it had always been that way. At the orphanage, staff noticed her growing confidence, how she volunteered to help younger children with art projects, how she spoke up more during group activities. She was no longer the quiet child sitting at the edge of the room, she was a voice, a presence, a part of things. For Alex, the change was both personal and deeply grounding. He had built companies, negotiated deals worth millions, and sat at tables where the stakes were measured in markets and influence, but none of it had carried the same weight as the day Emma wheeled herself toward him, holding a crayon drawing of the two of them on the playground. In her drawing, the wheelchair was just another part of the scene, no more remarkable than the swings or the sky, and he realized that was exactly how it should be. That evening, he began the legal process to adopt her, knowing in his gut it was the next step in a story neither of them had planned but both had needed. The months that followed were filled with adjustments, learning each other's routines, building trust, and making a home together. Alex transformed a sunlit upstairs room into her space, filling it with books, art supplies, and a window seat where she could watch the neighborhood from above. He installed ramps and adaptive fixtures without ceremony, not as special accommodations but as seamless parts of the home they were building. Slowly, the walls Emma had built around herself began to come down, replaced by the security of knowing that this was her place, her life, her family. One night, long after she was supposed to be asleep, Emma rolled quietly into his study. She sat for a moment in the doorway, the light from the hall framing her small figure, and then said softly, "Thank you for not being afraid that I'm not like everyone else." Alex set aside the papers on his desk and turned toward her, meeting her gaze with the same steady calm he had shown that first day. "Emma," he replied, "you are exactly who you're meant to be. That's not something to be afraid of, it's something to be proud of." She smiled, and in that moment, the years ahead stretched out before them, not as a question mark but as a promise. And so, what began in a shaded corner of a playground became a new life neither could have foreseen. The playground itself continued to hum with laughter, its ramps and swings bearing the scuffs of daily use, and Emma's voice became one of many that filled the air. Sometimes, Alex would stand at the edge, watching as she played with her friends, and think of all the barriers, both visible and invisible, that had been dismantled to make this scene possible. It wasn't just about a piece of land with bright equipment, it was about the way a community could be reshaped when one person refused to let someone sit on the sidelines. And in that sense, the playground was never just a playground, it was proof that change, once set in motion, could keep growing long after the first ribbon was cut. For me, the ending of this story works because it's not framed as a fairy tale where a wealthy man swoops in and fixes someone's life. It's a slow, deliberate transformation where dignity and belonging are built piece by piece. The real victory isn't the playground itself, but the way it changes the social fabric around Emma. By the final chapter, she's no longer the girl in the wheelchair, she's simply Emma, with friends, a home, and a voice in her community. What makes it powerful is that the resolution feels earned. Alex doesn't just give her material things, he dismantles the invisible walls keeping her on the sidelines and shows others why those walls never should have been there. The shock of the ending is in how ordinary the change becomes. Inclusion stops being a special act and turns into the default way people behave. It leaves you thinking about how many small, ignored moments like the one by the sandbox could be turning points if someone chose to act. It's a reminder that the measure of real change is not in grand gestures but in what remains when the spotlight is gone.